Hi there. My name is Peter Mayrick from Partners in Ministry. Thank you so much for joining us today in our leadership webinar series. This series we put together to try and deal with some of those issues that church leaders have to deal with and try and deal with some of the interesting work that you have to do as a leader of the church. You may know we did a survey at the end of last year and asked people, what are the core issues you'd like us to talk about? Some of you will know that we tried to do a burnout and resilience webinar last month. Unfortunately, I apologise, one of our speakers had a very, very sore back and wasn't in a condition to present. So we're going to do that on October the 13th, so put that in your diary. But today we're here to talk about the important topic of small groups. And so the topic is getting the most out of your small group ministry in a post-COVID world. Partners in Ministry exists. Our aim is to see churches flourish by helping leaders to lead churches well, by helping leaders personally to flourish and then leaders to lead well. And so today, as we talk about small groups, our objective is to support you and to help you as you lead churches that have small groups in them, particularly on this side of COVID. Let me just say from a logistics point of view, we have a chat screen and we have a Q&A screen. If you have a question you'd like to ask, please don't be backward. Please put it into the Q&A screen and we'll do our best to deal with your question. If we don't, we'll try and deal with it afterwards through email. But let me start by introducing our speakers today. I'm really pleased to have John Jeffries, who is going to speak about the importance of small groups. John has been with Partners in Ministry as a ministry partner for the last 5 years. What does it mean to be a ministry partner? Well, ministry partners walk beside church leaders. Some people call that walking beside coaching, others call it mentoring. More and more, we recognise the role of pastoral supervision, and most of our ministry partners have been accredited as pastoral supervisors. But our objective is to walk beside pastors, church leaders, both personally and professionally. John has been doing that for the last 5 years, and those who work with him will be greatly appreciative of the work that he does. Before that, John worked for many, many years and led Christian Blind Mission. So he comes to the table with a whole lot of corporate experience, working beside pastor experience, and he's a lay preacher himself. We're then going to move to Arthur Konomos, and I'm really pleased to have Arthur Konomos on the Partners in Ministry team. Arthur has been a ministry partner in Queensland for just over a year now. Prior to that, he was a main player, a key operational figure within Compassion Australia. So Arthur understands how to get things done. But in church life, in his church, he's been in small group ministry and small group leadership for many, many years. So Arthur's going to start reflecting on what he's learned in the post-COVID world. So thank you again so much for joining us. I'm going to hand over to John. John's going to put some slides on the screen. John, it's so good to have you here. John, why don't you start by telling us, what do you think is so important about small groups?
Thanks, Peter, and it's really terrific to be with you. And I just love the topic of small groups. because of the personal impact small groups have had on me and my family. My wife, Alice, and I, we have had a small group meet in our home for the last 35 years. And many, many people have come through that small group over the years, and we've had the honour and the privilege of walking with people through some of the most significant parts of their life. We've had the honour and privilege of getting to know people at the deepest possible level, and it's just been a wonderful experience. So my own personal experience is so positive of the role of a small group in my life, and I see the importance of small groups impacting church members' faith all over the nation. I want to start by just showing you a few basic stats that we have around small groups. And basically, through our work with partners in ministry, we've looked at stats from the Bureau of Stats, the National Church Life Survey, McCrindle stuff. We've also looked at basically every book that's been written on small groups. And we've accumulated a body of knowledge that really helps us understand the importance of small groups. One question that's been asked of people, we ask, why did you leave your previous congregation? And I don't know what you may think the most common reason people leave a congregation is. Statistically, the most common reason a person leaves a congregation is because they move. They move to a new area. In fact, 70% of people that leave your church statistically leave because they're moving. It causes you to raise the question, well, if there are people moving out of our area, we've got to think about the people who are moving into our area, new people to our church, and what is a good way to bond people into the life of our church. Apart from moving, the next common factor we saw when people leave a church is that most people who actually leave a church, the only connection they have to the church was the Sunday service. So if you wanted to be prophetic, if you like, and predict which church members are likely to leave your church in the years ahead, you would look at those whose only connection to you is on a Sunday. So we see the role of small groups as being really important in bonding people to the life and ministry of the church. And why did we focus on small groups? Basically, we see in Acts that the early disciples, the early church, they met in their homes. We've seen small groups have been around for a long time. And then the writer to the Hebrews reminds us not to forget about how we go about stirring up one another to love and good works and not neglecting to meet together. So we see several biblical reasons why small groups are important. And when I use the term small groups, you can do a bit of a translation to your own context. Some will call them growth groups, small groups, gospel groups, life groups, community groups, cell groups. Don't mind what you call them. Whatever the small group ministry is of your church, that's what we're talking about today. Here's an interesting stat that's rather impactful. What we find is that 63% of people who regularly attend a small group say they look for opportunities to share their faith. And when we compare that to the group that does not attend a small group, only 22% of them say they actively look to seek for opportunities to seek to share their faith. So that's a basic confronting stat that people who are in a small group are 3 times as likely to be looking for opportunities to share their faith. Some other stats, and don't worry, we don't have too many stats, but what we do know is that churchgoers who belong to a small group are 79% more likely to be attending your church weekly. They're 69% more likely to self-report that they feel closer to God. They're 74% more likely to say they understand the Bible better, and they're 66% more likely to say that they trust God more. So these are some rather startling and confronting stats that are really showing us what that potential impact is on your church member's life if they join and are part of a small group. So we see a really large opportunity here. For most churches, a large portion of your church may already be in small groups. But what we're seeing is that being part of a small group strongly impacts your members' faith. What we also know is that small group leaders generally say they are looking for more direction. So a question for us today is, how do we help our small groups be as healthy as they can be? And I think there's three things we'd like to show you today. First, we want to talk to you about having a clear and common purpose for your small groups. Secondly, we want to encourage you to prioritize the importance of small groups in the life of your church. And thirdly, we want to start you thinking about how you actually celebrate the ministry of small groups. So firstly, let's think about what's the clear purpose of small groups in your church. And most people will have something around the in, out, and up model that's demonstrated here with the triangle. Most people will say that small groups have some sort of influence in maturing people in discipleship. We know that disciples are learners, so small groups are a great place for people to be learning. Also, it's a great place for community to form, for people to support each other in their walk, their own personal walk. In our small group, we've been privileged to see people come to faith. We've had people marry each other in small groups. We've had people die in our small groups. We've supported each other through the key moments of life very, very closely. And it's been just a wonderful experience for my wife and myself. The third aspect is looking outwards. And that's thinking about how we take our faith out into the wider world. So most churches will have some sort of threefold aspect to what their small group ministry is. Wonder what you think about what's one key personal habit that often leads to spiritual growth. And the research shows one of those key habits, it's not going to be a surprise to you, is reading the Bible personally and regularly. And small groups are just a really good way to encourage people to do that. It's a great thing that you can walk alongside people and encourage them in their own Bible reading and the consistency of their Bible reading. We want you to look at a small group as a community that loves each other. There's a consistency to it, a regularity to it, where people care for each other and where also they have the opportunity to contribute. And that might be equipping them through sharing stories, helping them with methods and ways they can be more comfortable and more active in sharing their faith. Also encouraging people and inviting non-church members to the church or even to the small group. And small groups are just a great way of welcoming your new members well. What is your pathway for a new person who comes to be part of your church? We know that roughly 60% of your first-time visitors will be people of faith, Christian people. Often they've moved from somewhere else, they're looking for a new church. A small group is a great a way in to join the life of a church for such people. People do ask us, what's the average attendance of small groups each week compared to Sunday services? Well, what we find generally is that most churches that have a small group ministry, if we take the first number being the average attendance on a Sunday, we'll find that most churches have between 50 and 70% of their attendees in a small group. The National Church Life Survey indicates that the top churches around Australia will have around 70% of their people in a small group. This is something for you to think about. How can you increase the participation of your church members into a small group? I want you to think about how small groups are communicated to your church. Are they communicated as something that are nice to do? Or do you really communicate them as something that's really quite essential for your spiritual growth? Do you actually talk about them almost on the same level of importance as attending on a Sunday? Is there encouragement from the front of the church, from the pulpit, from the leadership? Is there encouragement to make it your habit to be part of a small group? And often we like to see a clear connection with the vision and purpose of the church. Your church may have a vision or a mission statement, and it's really good to show people where a small group fits in to the mission and vision of the church. Could our small groups be more effective? This is a rather confronting stat. 75% of small group leaders say they would like more direction when it comes to their groups. Most small group leaders say that they would like more help and more resources, more direction, more support from the church leadership. So that's something you need to be thinking about, is how do you as a church support your small group leaders? In fact, one researcher concluded the small group ministry in the church actually rises and falls on the quality of its leaders. So you really need to take time to think about what the quality of your leaders are and how you're going about training them and supporting them and encouraging them. And therefore, the choice and accountability of leaders of your small group is really critical. Basically, you're looking for your leaders to be selected on three factors. You're wanting people who have the right character to lead a group. You're wanting people to have the competence to lead a group. And competence is something that you can train. Competence is something that you can improve. And also you want people who feel the call of God to be a leader of a small group in your situation. We want them to be convicted of the role that they're playing as a small group. One researcher said, if you take care of your small group leaders, they will take care of your small group system. And this is really, again, highlighting the importance, the integral role that small group leaders play in the life of the small group and the life of your church. So some questions that arise for you is, so when you think about the leaders of your small group, who are the people you're going to select to lead? How are you going to train them to be the best small group leader they could possibly be? What content would you use to shape that training? Are you going to use a syllabus or material? Do they follow the sermon pattern of your church, or is it more freewheeling that you allow the small group leaders to decide how they're going to run the group? How are you going to care for the leaders? How are you going to support them? How are you going to coach or mentor them during their ongoing leadership? And we want you to be taking your small group leaders on a journey where they improve their leadership of the small group. And we also want you to think about how the leaders are understood within the general leadership and oversight structures of the church. Are they seen as people leading an important ministry of the church? Because they are leading an important ministry of the church. Then the next area you need to be looking at is to the future. How are you going to identify, recruit, and train the future leaders for your church's small group ministry? There's some negotiables. The type of group you have, very negotiable. The way they gather, very negotiable. The curriculum structure, very negotiable. These are things that you make choices about. Some churches have groups split differently. Some small groups will be based around a common interest. Some it'll be a free market where everyone decides which group they want to belong to. Other small groups will be gender-based or demographically based. Some will be singles or married or mixed. Others will be intergenerational. Others will be neighbourhood-based. Others may be ethnicity-based. This is a style thing that you need to do with whatever best serves your church situation. The way they gather is really a choice for you too. Is it self-select? They choose which group they go to, or do you have a system where you allocate people to groups? The frequency with which your group meets is something else that needs to be discussed. Find that most groups meet at least fortnightly. Anything less than fortnightly, it does make it a bit hard to keep up with people as their life unfolds. Many groups meet weekly. My experience is our group meets weekly, and I find that a wonderful blessing because it plays such an important part in our life. Do you have a meal or not? That's a decision for you. I think there's something very special that happens when believers share a meal together. There's something that's very bonding and very caring and very uplifting about sharing a meal together. You can choose to share a meal together every week, or you can do it once a month. The style is up to you. Then think about how you're going to review your small group ministry. Usually a pastor or a support person will take time to visit a small group and check in on how it's going. Some churches now do some sort of spiritual growth survey. I know one large church which 4 times a year, they ask their congregation just to log in on their mobile phones, and they ask them 10 simple questions about their spiritual growth. So 4 times a year, they get a very good reading of where their church is going with spiritual growth. You may look at the number of new groups you've formed for the year. You may want to look and consider what % of members would you like to be part of a small group. And then I mentioned before, really celebrate the role that small groups play in your church members' life and faith. Tell stories of how people's lives have been turned around by participating in a small group. Celebrate when there has been a growth in numbers, and also think of ways you can share your appreciation for the leaders of your group. How do you thank them? Do you thank them through words of appreciation, small gifts, encouragement? It's really important that you appreciate the work that these leaders are doing week in and week out in their small group ministry. So what we've showed you, there's some real key opportunities here for you that small groups can and will effectively impact the members of your church faith, and that's a wonderful thing. They should have a clear and common purpose, and I think for most it will revolve around maturing people as disciples. It'll revolve around being a loving, supporting community of each other, and it'll revolve around them having eyes that look to the horizon, that look externally for how they can take some of your church ministry to the wider community. We want you to prioritize the importance of small groups. We want you to elevate it as a key ministry of your church. We want to encourage you to invest in the leadership of your small groups. And as I mentioned, we want you to take time to celebrate and review your small group ministry. So I hope that gives you some context and some background and some stats that give you some idea of what the importance of small group ministry is. And I'm now going to hand back to Peter, who'll introduce you to Arthur for the next part of our webinar. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you, John. That's so appreciated, brother. So what I'm hearing you say is small groups have a very big impact on what's going on in the church. As a church consultant, it's interesting when you ask people, what are the meetings that we have in church? You've got the large meeting on Sunday, and then 40 to 70% of people are in these things called small groups in most churches. When you talk about culture, what we realize is that there are 2 meeting places where culture has been formed. And so small group leaders are a really important part of that culture formation. It's really important to know that, isn't it? Arthur, you're going to tell us a little bit more. We're going to talk about small groups on the other side of COVID. Tell me, mate, your history with small groups. Why do you want to speak about small groups?
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Yeah, like John, I've had a long history with small groups, and they've made a big difference in my life and the life of my wife and my 2 adult children. So Look, apart from conferences and seminars and reading over the years, I've been involved in small groups for almost 40 years and various, either leading them or involved in them, from being a young adult and then being involved in family and adult and men's groups. And I've just seen the difference that they've made in people's lives. So yeah, excited to be able to talk about it today.
Terrific, mate. Why don't you share with us about small groups on the other side of COVID?
Yeah, great. Thank you. John's given us a great overview today of all the things to consider when we're looking at effective small group ministry. And sorry, just organise my screens here. And so as we've heard, it's important not only to have a lot of people involved in small groups, but because we know they're important and John's told us why, but we want to make sure that they're effective as well. And so we want to get under the hood of some of the issues that can arise in the running of our small groups. And as a general statement, I want to encourage you to be inquisitive and to ask questions about what you're doing in your small group ministry. And so, first of all, let's consider what might have changed since the start of COVID. And so we need to ask a few questions. What was different during lockdowns? And I think one of the obvious things is that we had less contact with everybody, including church staff. I know in larger churches, the model is always spoken about that small groups are likely to be the place for pastoral care and for close connection. But we need to ask the question, did that model hold up during lockdowns? Did the role of small group leaders and pastoral staff in your pastoral care model potentially change during this time? And look, I'd like to suggest that maybe it did. We no longer had the brief interactions that you have in the normal life of the church. Obviously, we're used to going to church, and then we have an opportunity after a service to meet with other members of the congregation and also to cross paths with pastoral staff. But that wasn't happening during COVID. And so I think it's possible that if members of your congregation haven't heard directly from a member of staff since the start of COVID, that will have been noticed by some people. Now, please hear me here. Obviously, in the early months of COVID, you would expect that the church staff would have really been concentrating on people of high need. And obviously, they had a lot of work to do to start creating online services and keep up with all of the lockdown restrictions. But I think as we got into months 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, if church staff weren't making any contact with people in the church, and if small groups weren't able to meet because of lockdown restrictions, I think it's possible that people may have been noticing that. And it's probably helpful for you to know that some churches did have staff more involved in that response. And so, further into COVID in months 4, 5, 6, 7, they would have been going through lists of who regularly attends our church and then dividing up those lists and making phone calls. So some churches did things like that and others didn't. The reason I'm asking the question is, do you know how your congregation felt about your church's response to COVID? And then you might be thinking, well, why am I still talking about lockdown? Surely we're past that. Well, I want to suggest let's hope they are behind us, but it's more about establishing a context for your ministry now. And so I think it's important to know the answer to those questions as you moving forward, which leads me to these questions, which I'd encourage you to ask. How did your church come out of lockdowns? How's the relational health of people in your church after the impact of COVID restrictions? Again, maybe they're feeling further in the past than they were a few months ago, but it's still worth asking the questions. How have people come out in the last 2 years? And I think you'll find that the response to this is different for different people. Some people are craving face-to-face interaction because they felt very starved of social interaction during COVID. Some people are just a little bit wary about how much time they want to spend with other people. Some of us feel like we have less socializing capacity than we had before. And so you get a mixture of all of those things. I mean, I know from my wife and I that after coming out of periods of lockdown, if we went out to an event for a night, we felt like we needed a couple of nights off. So we weren't as match fit as for socializing as we were before. So it begs the question, is a remedial or catch-up approach needed for our small group ministry? Almost a relaunch or a reset, acknowledging what we've gone through. And maybe the start of 2023 is a good time for this. I know a lot of us came out of 2020 thinking 2021 was going to be the reset. And then we thought 2022 was going to be the reset. Maybe it's 2023. So it's just worth asking that question. So I think it's helpful to consider all of these things as you're planning the way forward, as the answers should inform what you do next in your small group ministry. There's no point launching into things if people aren't ready, or launching without understanding where people are at. So it's all about establishing the context for our own church. A couple of other things to consider. If small groups, as John has contended, really are the most significant gathering outside of a Sunday, does the support of staff reflect this? So is it worth your church staff having a greater presence at key leadership events that they may not have attended before? Often it's associate pastors or lay leaders that are looking after small groups. And I want to ask the question, and don't worry, I'm going to qualify this in a minute for any of you that are wondering if I'm realizing how tough it was for senior pastors during COVID, but could the senior pastor attend occasionally, or even record a short video message that could be played at some of these key leadership gatherings? And I mean, I think this is a credit to senior pastors because it's the influence that they carry. And as I said a minute ago, I know senior pastors or church staff can't attend everything. I worked for a church for 10 years and I know how hard it is to attend everything, but it speaks to the priority that John talked about. And the last couple of years have been difficult, but for pastors, but their presence might make a real difference in some of these key gatherings. I want to ask, do your small group leaders know what the church is currently focusing on and what the church hopes small groups will provide at this time? And again, John alluded to this. And we know that there'll be a whole lot of things that generally our small groups are focusing on, which is discipleship and pastoral care and learning and community and service. But if there are specific things to be emphasized, leaders can't lead in a direction that they don't know about. And as John has said, alignment between church staff and key volunteers really makes a difference. And it impacts the effectiveness of the ministry, but it also really values your leaders. I want to change gears a little bit now and talk about potential development areas for your small group leaders. John's told us that our small group leaders are telling us that they want to be developed. And I want to suggest that no one's good at everything. And so before I get to that first point, I just want to say, I think often leaders are chosen because they're good at predominantly one thing. And I think those things, that thing often falls into one of two categories. So either they're recognized as someone who has great Bible knowledge or teaching ability, and so they'll be able to play that role in a small group. And then I think we have another group of small group leaders, and you can call it hospitality or influence, but often they're the sorts of people that gather people, they're leaders, they gather people around them. But even though they might be good at those primary functions, there might be other things that they're not so good at. So let's talk a little bit about some of the things. And the first one I want to talk about is hosting online groups. Now, hopefully this is largely behind us, but I still think it's worth mentioning because doing this well makes a huge difference to the experience for everybody. And so some of the ways that we could help our small group leaders is helping them choose the best software platform. When we're talking to we want to help the people that are actually attending the group to be able to be seen on screen. So our leaders need to be able to encourage people to make sure that they're actually in camera shot during the call. But at the same time, they need to recognise that one of the big things that came out during COVID and Zoom meetings is that some people hate being seen on the screen. So they need to do that in a sensitive way. And some of those things sound incredibly obvious, but trust me, I've sat in a couple of hundreds of hours of Zoom meetings over the last 2 or 3 years, and these things make a big difference. So encouraging people to mute when they're not speaking so that the background noise doesn't distract people. Recognise there's a time delay between one microphone cuts out and the other one cuts in. So the host needs to keep watching and maybe invite people to speak. Also think there's a really creative opportunity here. I'm going to use a dangerous stereotype. I know that all young people aren't good with technology, and I know all seniors aren't bad with technology, but just bear with me for this example. Imagine if you did have some groups of senior small groups and they need help with their technology. And let's say on the same night, we have a young adult small group with a lot of people that are actually pretty good with technology. Imagine if the young adult group closed down for the night and individually went to the home of a senior and met with them, maybe even better, had a couple with them before their small group started, make sure their computer's working, and actually help them be online for their small group experience. Again, maybe this is all behind us, but if it's not, that would be a great thing to do. Next thing I want to talk about is, just let me get my screen working, is handling difficult conversations. We live in turbulent times, especially because of social media. In the last couple of years, we've had Donald Trump, US elections, Black Lives Matter, responses to COVID, including lockdown restrictions and vaccinations. There is so much that people can potentially be in conflict about. And I think sometimes we could help our small group leaders to be ready for this. It's always so much better to set expectations up front on any topics, but particularly something like this. So we could help our small group leaders to know how to create some ground rules and some boundaries at the start, but also could coach people with simple strategies to employ if necessary. A couple of years ago, my wife came home from a Hillsong Colour conference, and she showed me a resource that she got from that talked about how to engage well with people who have different opinions and how to check your own opinion and how to share it well. And so I'll talk more about resources later, but maybe that's something that we can help our small group leaders with. This next one sounds really obvious. Excuse me, and that is communication and coordination. But again, remember, if the primary skill of your small group leader is Bible teaching, maybe they're not great at this. So when are we meeting? Where are we meeting? How are we meeting? Who's meeting? If we're sharing a meal, what are the organisation? What's the organisation of that? And again, my reminder here is if it's not the leader's thing, encourage delegation, or at least sharing the responsibility amongst the group. Hosting and hospitality. And I know I'm saying this a lot, but it sounds obvious, but it's not. I'm sure we've all been to a small group at some stage where we arrived, the room wasn't set up, it wasn't a warm setting. No one welcomed us at the door. If we're there for the first time, we didn't really know who we were meeting. Introductions weren't done. You'd be surprised how many people don't do this well. And how the space is set up can make a huge difference. Small group teaching versus preaching. People that make great preachers don't necessarily make great small group leaders or teachers. And so is the teaching style that's taking place in the group relevant for the group? I think a great skill to have as a small group leader is to really understand the art of suggestion and the art of asking really good questions that draws answers out of people. We want to be on a joint journey of learning and discovery. And so that's something that we can really help our small group leaders with. Next area I want to talk about is facilitating skills. I mentioned this before with online groups, but it's also relevant for face-to-face. It's a real skill to help people to contribute. You've got to be respectful in the way that you do that, and you need to do it with safe questioning. But it's really important to be able to draw people into the conversation. And there's always got to be an easy out for people that don't have anything to share. But just coaching your small group leaders and how to do that in a safe way can be really helpful. So for some people, you'll want to invite them into the conversation. You also want to help your small group leaders when they have oversharers, and give them some really easy lines that they can use to just, say, thank you, John. Look, I'll come back to you if I have time. I really want to hear what somebody else in the group say. So we need to leave space for others to be able to contribute and give them simple strategies to be able to do this. Look, I know from experience, both in small groups and even boards that I've chaired, that I've come to know that in those groups that there's people that will never volunteer an answer. And yet every time I check in with them, they're sitting on some real gold. And so I've realized with those people that it's important that every now and then I just check in with them to find out if they've got something they want to contribute. There's always got to be an easy out if they don't have anything. But if I don't ask them, we're poorer for it, because often they're people that are sitting on some great wisdom. John talked about training leaders, and I just wanted to mention we need to recognise that people are time poor. So I'd encourage you to look for options online. So you might do some of your training online. I really encourage you to also think about recording any training that you do, whether it's face-to-face or online, so that anybody that misses the training event can still catch up by having the link sent to them. And you might want to alternate between face-to-face and online training. It's really important to make sure that the meetings feel important. So with good content and the right people there, because as John said, we want to prioritise what we're doing in our small group ministry. I also suggest that intergenerational training events are really important if possible. I think sometimes, even without meaning it, we end up training in generational silos. What I mean by that is sometimes the young adult small group leaders get together, the young family small group leaders get together, our adult leaders get together, and maybe our seniors groups get together. There's some real energy and encouragement that can come from intergenerational gatherings. So we're much poorer for it when we're siloed. I talked a little bit earlier about resources. I would encourage you to provide great resources for your small group leaders. One of the things that my church does is that we have a church-wide license for Right Now Media, which means that any of us that are regularly involved in our church have a way of accessing that material for free. And so on that platform, there's a whole lot of small group resources, as well as lots of other resources and training materials. So it's a great way of valuing your leaders. The other thing is maybe get experienced leaders to share something that's really worked for them, because it again, it values their contribution and it prevents us from being too staff-centric in what we're doing. John talked about the need for profiling our small group ministry, and again, just to make some suggestions, John talked about this and I'll repeat it. We need to promote the why. We don't want to get up in front of the church and say you need to be in a small group because you need to be in a small group. You need to be in a small group because we've discovered that they're the most effective places for discipleship, as well as service and care for each other and communities. So the why is very important. Video content is great. Senior pastors love this.
Click send private.
So
thanks, mate.
If you're trying to promote your small group ministry, get around and try and get some short interviews and video clips of a whole lot of different styles of groups and different leaders. And it will be a lot easier to get permission to show this content in a service rather than asking people to get up and speak, because obviously you've got the opportunity to edit and make sure it's short and succinct. Again, try and involve all generations. This will bring new energy and enthusiasm to the ministry. The other thing is it needs to feel like something that people want to do, not just an obligation. So when does your promotion of small groups feel like something that people need to do or should do, or hopefully after your promotion, people just can't wait to sign up? Briefly, before I finish, I want to talk about the big three that always come up when we're talking about small groups. How do we sign up or form groups? Are the groups open or closed? And should groups split? Well, firstly, how do people sign up? Do we allocate people, or do people choose groups? Some have suggested over the years that allocated groups work better for young or new Christians, and maybe not so well as people get older. They're more likely to want to choose their own group. So my question there really is, do we do the same thing for everybody, or do we have to have a slightly more nuanced approach? How do we sign up? Obviously, maybe it's paper, maybe it's digital, or a combination of the two. But the main thing is just think about the best way to enable people to sign up to your small groups. Are groups open or closed, and when should we split? Well, firstly, on the open or closed, I go back to the why. Why do we exist? I would have thought in most cases we should want to grow. So in most cases, they're going to be open. And I think really the main reason we would ever have a closed small group would be because we're working with vulnerabilities or specific confidentiality issues. And finally, when should groups split? Well, first I'd say create an expectation at the start. If we're talking about discipleship groups, I'd hope they're going to grow, which means that hopefully splitting will be a good problem. And then again, let's be creative. Maybe they can progressively split. They could start by alternating full group 1 week, split group the next week. Often the leadership of the new group is an issue. And again, I'd encourage you to think outside the group. I find in most churches, often there is a small group in the church where leaders are in a group with other leaders. So maybe we can borrow somebody from one of those groups to help us out. So just a couple of final thoughts from me before we finish. In summary, I'd say, consider how you've come out of COVID. I've said 2 years for COVID, but we're nearly at 3. So consider how you've come out of COVID so you know your context. What's the focus of your small group ministry in this next season? And are you all on the same page, paid staff and volunteers? Because that alignment is so important. Can I encourage you to ask good questions of your ministry, be creative and try new things? And finally, are there some specific training topics that would be helpful for your leaders in this season, out of the ones that I've mentioned, or maybe other ones that you've thought of? And I realize that I've asked maybe as many questions as I've answered. And obviously, these are some of the sort of topics that we explore with pastors and churches when we're working with them. So thank you for your time. Hopefully, I've said something of value to you today, and I want to throw back to Peter.
Thank you so much, Arthur. Friends, I hope that was really helpful for you. One of the things that I've noticed that Arthur, as he said, he asked lots of questions. That's because the answer to most of those questions is it depends. And as Arthur said, one of the things we want to do as ministry partners is to work with you, to support you, to be a sounding board, to just get you to think about things and help you to do those things. Arthur and John, one of the things that people will be saying is, you both said we need to equip leaders more. And I know most church leaders are sort of up to here and saying, oh, I don't know if I can do any more. But that's what we're for. We are here to support pastors. And John, we run lots of workshops with pastors and church leaders where we actually walk in and help the pastor to create that alignment. And I know you've run a few of those workshops. I'm wondering, mate, have you seen any demonstrative changes as you do those and as you work beside pastors and in churches?
Absolutely, Peter. I've had the honour of churches asking me to go and run workshops, and we often get all the small group leaders together. And we run through some of the material that you've seen there, and we have a time for them. Usually we end with some time to think about what they're doing really well, what they could improve, and if there's anything they need to stop doing. And out of that usually comes some really compelling ideas of just how churches can make their small groups even more relevant to people. And I think, funnily enough, I think COVID's actually taught us some things that we may not have learned without COVID. Just 2 weeks ago, our twin grandsons gave my wife and I a present that was called a sore throat. And so with 1 day's notice, we called off our small group. Tuesday night, we sent out a thing saying, we're not meeting Wednesday night, but we're going to Zoom. And because everyone's really familiar with Zoom, 7:30 Wednesday night, the whole group's on Zoom. Yeah. And we had a time of spiritual input. We had a time of sharing our lives together. And we prayed together for a couple of hours. And it was just brilliant. So I see that COVID has actually given us some things that a tool that we wouldn't have otherwise had that we can really use to keep our small groups even stronger.
Yeah, thank you, mate. Friends, thank you for the questions that are coming through. Please do feel free to load a question if you've got a question. One of the things, guys, that is there also is you said, and rightly so, I think we mostly choose small group leaders because we trust them with the scriptures, and that's so important. And John said that quite clearly up front. It seems to me most often the training we do is how to read the scriptures rather than the sorts of things that Arthur has spoken about. Friends, one of the things we like to do at Partners in Ministry is to then provide that training. So Arthur talked about delegation. John talked about evaluation, which is really coaching. If you want us to come and do that training in your church, we'd be very happy to do so. We love to do that sort of training. Arthur, I've got a question for you. What do you do? Because there'll be people on this call who are saying, it's fair enough to say all of that, but I don't reckon I've got enough leaders to choose from. I don't have enough leaders. So it's not, for me, it's not about choosing people and then training them. I just feel as if I don't have enough leaders in my church. What do you say to that?
Yeah, thanks, John. Yeah, look, that's a difficult problem. But again, I think sometimes we can be creative in the response. So for example, there's some really good video small group study resources out there. For example, the short answer is that I'm going to suggest a short-term and then a long-term response. So the short-term response is, well, maybe if we don't have enough leaders, for the people who want to be in a small group and don't have access to one, we might start meeting at the church on a Thursday night. The first half an hour is using a really well-produced video resource. And then even within the church building, we will break into some small groups that can be led by people that wouldn't be ready to lead a small group in their home, but will agree to lead through a series of questions in a church environment. The other thing is, like I said, if you're in a church that already has some small groups, but you don't have enough, one of the things that I've found is that often there, as I said earlier, there are small groups where leaders are leading other leaders. And so sometimes it's just a matter of saying, maybe we can lend you out for a little while to start help get some other groups off the ground. And you will find that there are people that say, I'm not ready to run a small group yet. But they would run a small group if they had somebody else that was buddying up with them. And then longer term, I just say, build it and they will come. But sometimes for some churches, it's a long process of going, okay, we've got to start from scratch and we've got to re-envision the church in the area of small groups. We need to profile it. We'll need to train leaders and then obviously start building up groups. But that'll take a long time. Final bit of the answer is, and this is going to sound like a contradiction because we've talked a lot about the qualifications of leaders, but is it possible that sometimes we set the benchmark for new leaders too high?
Oh, yes.
And so I think we need to allow people to progressively grow into their leadership. And it's okay for people to be fledgling leaders when they first start.
You mean we're in for the long game? We're in the game that is equipping from 0 to 10, not to straight to 10 straight away. Thank you, mate. That's really, really helpful. Both of you have kind of framed that it's really important that people understand what we're here for. You both use the word alignment. John, you went on to getting towards the idea of celebration and review. I want to point out, I think that the two most important things for doing small group well is actually alignment and clarity, which you both said, and then evaluation. And evaluation is the trickiest thing for many people because we don't know how to do it well. If you evaluate, you then celebrate because you identify the things that are doing well. If you're confused by that, we'd love to help you. We do a training course on coaching, and we'd love to train people on coaching. John, just a quick question for you. You said that this is good and that the percentage of people in a church varies. What do you think is a good percentage of people to have in small groups for a healthy church?
Yeah, the numbers I'm seeing from the churches that I'm involved with, and also from the NCLS research, is showing that if you take your Sunday attendance, about 70% of that number is towards the top echelon of what the churches with a really good small ministry are looking at. So about 70% of your members in some form of small group.
And that's the high level, isn't it? The thing that I noticed, by the way, culture is what we're talking about, creating a discipleship culture. If you've got 40% of people in your church, just 40% of people in your church in small groups, then small groups and small group leaders, as John said, is influencing your church culture. That's why this is essential to think about. A really good question on the Q&A is from someone who's about to lead leading the small group ministry. How do I finish well with leaders? Well, I think the most important thing is to pick up what John said. John said, celebrate, say thank you. In a previous church of mine, we invited everyone to our place and just put on dinner and spent the time to say thank you and prayed. I think at the end of each year, you need to give people the option of not leading next year. If you're exhausted, you need to have the option to not lead next year. And I think that's important to know. There's a question there about fledgling leaders, John, and I'll read it to you. And this will have to be the last question. I'm sorry, mate. Fledgling leaders start leading. How do we do this with the expectation around leadership codes of conduct after the Royal Commission? It seems like there is now a higher expectation around who can lead.
Yeah, and there are some, Arthur talked about us setting the benchmark too high sometimes in what we think of leadership. Certainly that bar could be lowered, but there's aspects around the code of conduct that can't be lowered. So you do need to ensure that your all leaders of your church, but your small group leaders meet the standards of your denominational code of conduct. Absolutely. I don't actually think that's a large hurdle for most to get over. I think the more common hurdle is I just don't feel adequate to do this. I feel a bit shy or inhibited.
Yeah.
And so Arthur's idea of giving people an apprenticeship, doing something at the church, getting them to do Q&A first, walking alongside, encouraging them, all of that is just really interesting stuff that you can think about that's going to raise up future leaders for your small group ministry.
Thank you, brother. Thank you, John. Thank you, Arthur. Friends, I reckon the bar is often set too high also on Bible knowledge. We often recruit people and say, you don't know the Bible well enough. I don't think we need Bible experts to lead small groups. We need people who are confident in the scriptures. And what I mean by that, there are people in our churches who are trained theologically to answer any question. A small group leader doesn't need to be able to answer any question. And we need to fill them with the confidence that that is the case. There are people you can ask those questions of, and they're often the minister. But I do need you to have confidence that the scripture speaks to this issue and have the confidence to say, I know it's in there somewhere. Let's have a look and see if we can get it together. And I think that's a challenge for many, many leaders, church leaders, is to think, how low, where is that bar of Bible knowledge before you're going to trust someone to be a fledgling leader? And of course, we want them to know more. But to have someone who doesn't have confidence in the scriptures, now we're in dangerous waters. Guys, on that last one, I just also want to say, if you're sticking to John's script of clarity, which includes Royal Commission, expectations, clarity, and then evaluate, you actually will meet the requirements of the Royal Commission. You'll ask the questions that matter, and you possibly will observe people who you might be concerned about to see that they're meeting that standard. Friends, we've got to finish now. We've gone to our hour. I just want to say to John and to Arthur, thank you so much, guys. That was so helpful for me. I hope it was helpful for everyone else on this webinar and to anyone else watching this afterwards. We will post this on our YouTube channel for you afterwards. Will you please, if you're interested in any training, please contact us. We'd love to help you. You can contact us through our website at www.partnersinministry.com or through our email address, which is info@partnersinministry.com. Please join us. We'll send a message out shortly for our next webinar, which is on the 13th of October at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Avoiding Burnout and Building Resilience. Kirsty Bucknell, our organisational psychologist, is going to join us. Kirsty did a PhD on resilience in ministry. And Mark Connor, who has been a senior leader of large churches and worked beside many pastors who's wrestled with burnout and written books on this. Friends, I hope you do join us 13th of October on burnout and resilience in ministry. But for today, I thank you so much for joining us. Please don't forget to make contact with us if we can help you in any way. And to John, to Arthur, thank you so much. And to the Lord, we give you great thanks. God bless you. Thanks.